ticks are going to be the values that we're looking for in terms of how we are getting to doing the editing that we are about to do. Please go ahead and create a brand new instrument track. You can make it stereo, Command-Shift-N, and make a brand new instrument track. And for now, just use the mini grant, please, because this will give us the ability to, and I know there's a lot of other virtual instruments available. This will give us the ability to be a little more precise in how we are actually going to generate our performance. If your audio engine is not set to the Inbox Pro, please go to Setup, go to Playback Engine, and just double check that your audio engine is set up to Inbox Pro. All right, so in your mix window, please make sure, again, you're on the MIDI grant. What I'm going to have you do, bless you, what I'm going to have you do is we're going to do two things. First of all, we're going to talk about quantization in the post and how we actually generate quantization information after the performance has been completed. So that's one of the factors we want to focus on first, because it is more likely that you will have a harder time working on other people's timing than you will working on your own, because of course you becoming a very skilled engineer will track in time, where you will work with a lot of people that it won't. So let's first of all talk about post quantization and some of the properties. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do our own little performance, each of you. So make sure your headphones are plugged in and everything's running. Jason, was your output okay?
No, in Setup, Playback Engine, it's saying it's on the Pro Tools Aggregate I/O.
Yes, and does it not give you an option for?
Right.
Go ahead and switch to built-in output. Well, actually, we'll have to do it this way. Did you save the hard drive?
I'm on the desktop.
Oh, you are? Okay. Let's go. This one's you? I'm just going to move you here for a second. And then, just in case we lose the computer altogether. Toggle this off and on, toggle this off and on. And once this goes back up, reopen the session. Once the hard drive comes through, open it in the drive. It should probably still not show Inbox Pro. When it doesn't, go up to this and switch to built-in output. It'll toggle it, it'll recycle it one more time, and then you can go back and do it one more time and it'll be there.
All right, thank you.
Oh, did that come back? Let's try this. Ken, was yours working?
No.
Hit OK. Ken, can you, are you on the hard drive? Is your session saved to the hard drive?
Mine, yeah.
Let's go. Let me close this. Is it? Oh, it's on your personal hard drive? I'm going to eject both for now. I'm going to toggle the audio. If you can power your drive down and then the other drive down, and then toggle the. Well, actually, we'll get it for you. And we'll toggle this. As soon as this goes back up, these will go back up and we can fire it. And if yours doesn't relink, just disconnect the cable. Power down, disconnect, reconnect, and power up. Is yours just working okay?
Yeah, I just had the mouse guy.
Oh, yeah, got it.
Thing I gotta put in my driver here.
Yeah, it's typical on a daily for you to have to troubleshoot the audio engine.
Yeah.
A lot of times, all you have to do is, when it doesn't appear on the playback engine list, just pick any one. It'll shut it down, reopen it, and then if you do it one more time, it'll show up as long as you toggle it on and off.
Mm-hmm.
The only downside is that the hub that links these together, since there's only one port to the computer, if you power down any one thing, they'll all go out. So if you, sometimes it'll happen because students power down a hard drive or powered up a hard drive, and because it's on the same hub as the interface, it'll
wax out.
Yeah, and so it's like kind of it's a pain because they all have to go up at the same time, they all have to go down at the same time.
Right.
There's not a really great method to it either and that's why the best thing to do is have students just start from an off position with, even though these will always get left on, and they want us to leave them on, don't know exactly why, but they're like, just leave them on.
Powering back on, off and on.
Right, and but a lot of times they don't fire up right away, so it's probably about, well, I've already had 2 students not come up right off the bat, so 2 out of 5, you know. So, you know, it's safe to assume, and a lot of times I let them know, never walk in on a computer that's on. If it's on, reboot it before you ever do anything else. Right. Because these particular machines could be, last thing they could have done could have been anything. And, did you rename it? Okay, so you go to setup. Go back in. Hit the list. Yeah, that was the top. There it is. So you go up. No. DK. There you go. And it'll toggle yes. Is it yes? It's okay. It'll cycle. Okay, now here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do with this is I'm going to have you go ahead and create a click track. So you'll just go, you'll actually go to track and hit create click track. So make sure that you actually have a click track engaged in this session. Now, my personal preference, you could have your own preferences, which is fine. And I've shown you this before, but I prefer to use the Marimba 2 because it's more like woodblock kind of sound instead of using that digital chirp. So if you want to use the Marimba 2 click, you can access that. What we're actually going to do is I'm going to have you actually do a... Sorry. Oh, no worries. I'll have you do an actual performance. On your virtual instrument. And what we can do before we fire this up, if we go to Window, MIDI Editor, so that you can actually see the piano view from the MIDI Editor. The MIDI Editor is essentially kind of a small format version of what the edit window looks like, but it's very detailed and focused on one element, and that's MIDI editing. So all we're going to do is we're going to actually have you just play something very basic to click. It can essentially be anything you like. Right now we're set up for piano, but what we're going to do as soon as we're done with this is we're going to switch over to a different type of virtual instrument where you'll begin to see even more importance in understanding the principles of quantization. So we'll actually begin with piano and then we'll move on to a virtual kit. Okay, so everybody's here so far, right? Yes? Okay, now before we get started, let's go to the mix window. Let's make sure our MIDI setup is actually available and correct. all you're going to do is record enable your instrument track. Please label it piano at this time before we start tracking. So we'll go ahead and record enable it. We'll call it piano by double clicking on the nameplate. And then if you can go to your view selector for the mix window, all we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the instrument pane is open and available. If you just select down here at the bottom, if you just select instrument, this will open up your I/O for your MIDI setup. Royce, did you sign in? All right, so with this selected, you're going to get a bank at the top, and essentially we did some work with this. Do you guys remember this when we were switching out who was responsible for which virtual instrument? And we actually used a single virtual instrument with multiple tracks, but all of them calling to the same virtual instrument. Do you guys remember that? That was actually 2 weeks before the break. That was like it would have been week 4. All right, well, in this instrument I/O, all we're looking at this point in time to receive controller data is to leave the input, which is the very top box, set to all. Is the inbox pro still not coming up?
It was coming up and it was giving signals that was getting out the
Oh, I see. And you had your virtual instrument, was it showing audio in your
It
mix?
was showing signal.
Oh, okay.
But I wasn't recording.
Okay, and notice what this is up top is this is very simply an I/O for the MIDI. This is your input, this is your output. A couple of features with this, with the input, we could be specific and say, you know, specific MIDI channels, 1 through 16. We could say specific MIDI ports that are available to us. But for now, we're going to say all, essentially meaning that any MIDI signal that gets received from a controller of any type will be put down this channel. It's a safe way to operate because at this point in time, if you're only using one controller, you don't care where it's coming from, you just want it to work. Essentially, this is the very, very quick version of, hey, let's plug and play, essentially. One thing you could do, like on my particular system, that the Nord lead, which is in the back, the large red keyboard back there, which has more of a weighted key kind of feel, and of course it's a larger range instead of the simple 25 key deal. If I wanted that to be cued in via MIDI, I could actually use that if I use the predefined Digio 3 port 2, essentially. And that would give me, by using a different port specifically, I could use that instead of the controller that I have hooked up there right now. If I left it at all, and I have 2 devices or even more than 1 device, maybe it's 5 devices connected, they'll all be linked in, meaning no matter what I play, if it's hooked into any of the following MIDI ports that are listed in this list here, they'll be active and available. But of course, normally you're not going to have a problem where you're going to be playing more than 1 device at one time. So all is, 80% of the time this will work. And if you're doing an advanced MIDI setup, then you'll have to look to the information specific to which device is going to be doing what and down what channel. Now this is the output selector. This output selector specifies that even though you see this down here, so just as a refresher, because we did go over some of this, even though you see this listed down here, unless it's listed as the output for the MIDI in this instrument I/O, it will not be played. So if I switch to none, I can record MIDI data down this instrument track all day. It will not perform anything to the MIDI grand. The benefit of that, and the reason why that's even an option, is because if you wanted to play it through the MIDI grand right now, but for other purposes, you wanted to go out an out port, you could go out of the Digio 3 port and send it to a different device and have that device be the element that's being played instead of the virtual sound. So if I wanted to use sounds off of the Nord and not off of Pro Tools' virtual instrument, I could output it basically to the port that it's connected to via MIDI. So At this point in time, though, we just want to make sure that we are actually listed as MIDI Grand 1-1. With this in mind, as long as this has been selected, all we have to do from this point is double check that when you play your keys, you're hearing sound. So as long as you have some sort of piano output through your keys, then we're good. Does anybody not have any keyboard control? Is it no keyboard control or just no sound?
No, there's neither.
Okay.
It's not giving me signal at all.
Bobby, what's yours doing?
It's not even playing the axiom. I can do it off the.
Are you record enabled at this point?
I'm gonna try that.
Bobby, are you record enabled?
No.
Can you record enable your track for me? And then see if it's still. What was the last thing that was Oh.
So I didn't have recording long.
Alright, for those of you who are up and running, if you guys that are actually up and running can go ahead and begin to start recording some mild performances. You don't have to do anything crazy. All I ask of you is that you start trying to record to tempo with the click. So whatever the click's doing in terms of the actual tempo. At this point in time, if you want to slow it down, remember that we have the ability to change the tempo right here from the get-go. If we just jump over into either event and do it through the drop-down list, or if we actually just click up on this, the little arrow here. If you want a BPM to something slow, that kind of gives you an opportunity to do a decent performance. If the click is too fast for you, you can go ahead and make an adjustment to the click. You can also do it in the transport. Let me jump back to Bobby. I think you're going to have to do, because you're still not getting any support from this, and the lines, this port is actually, it looks like it probably needs to be disconnected. The safest way to do it is kind of give the power down. If you just do it from reboot, like all the way. So if you, yeah. And then you're going to have to shut down the computer. And you can just set it to do a restart. You said shut down and we'll all pull it manually. You know, I'll fire it down and we'll just restart it. And it should fix the issue. As soon as this goes down, if you can just power that down. Alright, good luck. Okay.
Hold on, let's change this.
Well, this is this actually goes to 3. That may not be.
Okay, how many of you have tracked something? Royce, you working on it? Bobby, when you get a chance, just do a little something in there with the click. All right, so set up preview in Box Pro.
Kind of set that this just right there.
Oh, sorry. Never mind.
There's some run often.
Yeah, -4, even after it got reset. And that someone might have actually hit save on the parameter, on that patch that I loaded. And that might be the reason why, even though we've fired on and off, it still comes up as -4.
I see. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. And if Jason, if you don't mind just tracking a little bit. All right, sorry about the wait. I'm gonna go ahead and do my performance real quick, just something really quick and basic so you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about here. And this. All right, so everybody has their performance up, correct?
Yes.
All right, so what I'm going to do with mine is I'm going to go ahead and in a small frame, if we were to look on a measure-by-measure performance analysis, well, a lot of times what can be done with MIDI is very simply a grab, basically a grab and slide in grid form. As you can see, the grid points show timing elements as far as how the performance gets laid out. Now there are times that the performance does need to be a little ahead or behind the beat in order to match the feel of the actual song. But for the most part, what we're looking for is specific identifiers that not necessarily fall just close to the beat, but instead fall in the in-betweens, like say this instance right here, if it's not meant to be subdivided like that. In this grid form, what you can see as we zoom towards the top, for my specific performance, is the grid value actually equals 16th note. If I go back to something like 8th or quarter note, you'll begin to see some of these are in these little in-betweens, essentially anticipating the beat. You can see a majority of them aren't really all that bad, but watch what happens as we actually move towards quantization. Now, one specific thing you're going to want to do real quickly, make sure you're in your MIDI editing window, please. That way, if you go into your MIDI editor, you can actually just see this. You can access all of this information from the edit window as well. It's just that this kind of gives us a little more of a focused view on specifically just the MIDI events that are taking place. All we're going to do is hit Command A. So real quickly, just hit Command A. What that should do, if we look at it on a selection basis, is allow us to choose all of the MIDI events that have just been recorded. So you should see it, this is what it looked like before you hit Command A, and it should go into this kind of gray look where everybody's highlighted. Does that make sense? All right, so everybody so far has all of this selected.
No.
No? Okay. Bobby, where did you leave off?
Command A. It's not.
Are you in the editing window?
Yes.
Okay. You might actually have to click into the window real quick and then hit Command A. Because depending on the last thing you did, did you get it?
Yeah.
Okay. Darnell, where's yours? Nope. Okay. Let's go ahead and go up to event. And at the top, you see here there's several different event operations that are listed if we go to event operations that we can do specifically with MIDI information. there's a large list of parameters that can be changed. You can see velocity, which is essentially pressure, and which kind of gives you stressed and unstressed values for performance. It could be kind of very easily defined as how much pressure is being applied when you play. Duration, just the length of the overall notes. So if we wanted to modify how long each note set is, we could make those adjustments. Transposition, which of course is a just changing of pitch relative to each other. So they will all stay relative to each other, but of course they'll change key, or I'm sorry, not necessarily change key, but be transposed to whatever your specific note is. They could even be in the same key, but just a different set of pitches. Specifically, if you have harmonies, the major thirds, minor thirds, and fifths, however you're harmonizing, will stay relative to each other. Select / split notes, which gives you the ability to actually separate whose notes go where if you wanted to identify specific parts. You'll see a little bit of how that works out when you get into some of the elements with the scoring, when you actually start using the score editor. And then input quantize, which we will be using, step input, restore performance, and flatten performance. Flatten performance essentially takes all the features that are things that are happening in real time, and essentially takes the data and essentially thins it out so that the performance is not such a weighty thing on DSP. Yes, sir.
Sidebar. For a shortcut, what's that symbol? For
That's option.
Yeah, this one, the little elevator looking or escalator looking thing.
Right.
Yes.
okay.
Yep. What we're going to do today, we'll work on quantize, input quantize, and we already did step input, but I'll just remind you again what it is, because
I remember that.
yeah, it falls in line with essentially the quantization principles. Let's, for now that we have, and to make sure you have everything selected in the command A, so everything's selected, let's go to quantize, please. From this position, you'll see the layout of all the parameters that you get to choose from in terms of quantizing this. Now, again, quantizing is essentially going to take the kind of relative positions that the performance was laid out in and apply it to the grid. And essentially snap it to the grid or its closest grid point. And that's the very basic principle. As you see below, though, you see some very advanced principles that actually get used underneath this. So first of all, we'll start with I'd say the most basic way you'll quantize. A lot of times you may quantize this way for drum rhythms specifically, because they typically will have to be intact in terms of time, especially if you're going to loop them, if you're just generating beats per se. And I know a lot of guys like to trigger their beats instead of using sequencing, they trigger them, or should I say, by using drum computer type of sequencing, they essentially do their own sequencing manually. And the downside to sequencing manually is obviously if you fall out of beat, then there's editing that takes place. The really simple step in the post is quantization, is kind of forming, and we're going to do it on this note value. But notice here it says at the very top, it asks note on, note off. For this quantization, for now, we're going to use note on. If we were to select note off, it would also quantize the amount of time that happens afterwards, and where the note off actually takes place. So we'd see these, like particularly like this performance right here, would snap to a grid, particularly the nearest grid, but not dropped in the middle of nowhere like it is right now at the end of its duration. A lot of times you can get away with having note on being quantized while not utilizing the note off feature, because it gives it a little more feel. It takes away, it keeps it from being too rigid, essentially. What you'll realize if you ever do specifically play piano or anything MIDI based, a lot of what fills out the sound is actually a difference in time. Essentially the kind of the flam of the piano and how not every note hits at the same moment. That little bit of room gives it a fuller sound, because it essentially doesn't make it so blocked that it's like, that essentially the notes get harmonically buried inside of each other. Whereas them being off just a little bit in time begins to open up the sound. Kind of the same principle behind doubling vocals, where you're doubling a voice because the little bit of error or mistake between the two, even just in frequency difference, in pitch difference, in timing values, just fill it out a little bit because it's not so perfect. Unfortunately, perfect timing tends to hide and it's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing in some regards. Perfect timing tends to hide the performance in terms of which note or which element is supposed to be the emphasis. If everybody comes down at the same time, at the same velocity, obviously the same volume, there's no emphasis towards who's important. So you have to be careful about obviously preserving some sort of elements of the performance. So what we're going to do is we're going to do note on, we're going to preserve note duration. Below, listed, you see where it says quantized grid, and it says 1/16 of a note. What that's going to say is, how much do we quantize? How do we know from a quantization, and this uses the grid in the background, even though you don't see it. So let's just say I take this to the furthest. If I say to a 64th note, essentially, even though I don't see a 64th note, when I quantize, it's going to quantize to the nearest 64th note in the grid. And we don't visually get to see it here, it will actually just be applied. So it works off the grid even though we don't see the grid. And another thing to mention in that, we don't actually even have to be in grid mode when we edit this. We could be in slip and still utilize the quantization formats. Most of the time you quantize, the big thing you're really looking for when you're doing it is in terms of how much of a value that you need to go down to in terms of quantization, is you usually want to say, what's my shortest note in terms of where it starts, where it begins. Am I missing, do I have any notes that break in between the ones that I have set up here in terms of the grid? So when we look at this, if this grid's on 8th note, and I look here, the question being, do I have any things that are essentially going to be 16th notes in terms of the starting note position? I don't see any of those because most of these fall on an 8th note resolution in terms of the grid. You guys kind of see how that works out. I don't have any things that are realistically falling in between because they're supposed to. Most of them are falling in between because I'm ahead. You can kind of see that play out like right here, and then of course right here. And so with that being said, I'll probably want to choose an 8th note quantized to grid. The downside to picking too low of a resolution, or should I say too high of a resolution, if I go down to 32nds or 64ths, a lot of times what it'll do is it'll quantize to the nearest 32nd or 64th, but if I show you what that looks like on the grid, you see how small that is? Did you see? Yeah, this is 32nds. Did you see the change? What it'll end up doing is when it nudges it, it'll nudge it to the nearest 32nd. But that might not sound in time because the 32nd resolution may not be maybe enough of a resolution that will allow your performance to still sound pretty off. And that's one of the downsides to having the resolution be too small or too refined. So we try to keep it at the widest or largest amount that we can get away with while still preserving the performance. Now that takes us into the elements below. Now all I'm going to do is I'm going to quantize now so you can see it in action. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to undo it and I'm going to show you some of the elements that you get to offer for how quantization gets to be applied in here. I'm just simply going to hit apply. And all of these elements will get bumped to essentially their closest relative grid point. All right. Fair enough. Now, why don't for now, let's just have you do this with just that method, but please, as soon as you've done it and you see it and you hear it, go ahead and hit Command-Z and undo it. So it goes back to the original before you quantized it. If you need more than an 8th note, raise your hand and I'll come back. I'll come look at it and see if you technically do need you know, more than an eighth note, but most of you should only need an eighth note. Unless you were doing a lot of rapid things in your if you down tempoed and you did a lot of fast things in it, you might have needed a 16th or a 32nd.
Oh yeah, yours will be. Did you try to work at yours back down? Did you try to back down your grid a little bit? Just very simple, just over to that, right where the note is. Go to eighth. So what you're looking for is, at the start of these, do you have any of these that actually do split the grid? Or are you only needing an eighth note resolution? You see what I'm saying? Because all these starting points do fall in the eighth note category if you follow them. And of course, you have a lot more data this way, so you might want to go through and look. But for the most part, it looks like you're following an eighth note, so now I actually don't see any 16th spots at all.
Does that make sense? Ken, did you do that with yours?
Yeah.
Oh, you already did yours. Okay. Jason?
Yep.
Did you already do yours?
I'm doing it right now. So that way this is what you're saying.
Okay, yours is pretty easy to lay down.
Did you already apply yours? Was that a yes?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Probably already.
Oh, okay, you undid it.
Not yet.
Oh, okay, if you switch your resolution from 16th to 8th, a little over to the right, just click on the note itself. Yeah, there you go. Okay. What you're looking for here is, do you have any that split the grid and you don't fall on grid line? And so far I don't see any. Does that make sense?
I mean, oh yeah, okay. But still, you don't see any.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There aren't any performance values that would split the grid. So that's where your eighth note grid quantization works perfectly. Did you have any questions?
No, I'm good.
Please, someone let me know when it's 7:30. Okay. Most of you guys got through that already, right?
Yeah.
You already undid yours?
Yeah, I'm doing I tried eighths and it's a little bit different. I understand what you're talking about.
Oh, it's because, well, if you change this grid to 8th, just click on the note, and go to 8th. Is this, did you undo the quantization already?
I believe so. There was only a few things that were really wrong. Yeah, I had to.
Oh, okay.
Because I'm
Got
not
it.
going back to the
Now, one of the things you guys may have noticed, sometimes one of the problems that you'll find is if you perform, and I get this a lot, there are a lot of means for your performance, and I know because I've instructed a lot of students that have never touched a keyboard before in their life, and we've accomplished certain things based upon input quantization and step input that made their performance sound like they knew what they were doing. And that's great. The downside to this, though, is that you have to realize most of you were fairly close to the grid to begin with. I looked at all of your performances. Most of your performances were already either on the grid or close to the grid to begin with, so there wasn't a lot of variation where you were looking at it going, oh, it's so bad, and it was so bad, and I fixed it. So one of the things that you'll realize in this, in order to quantize successfully in the post, you have to be fairly close. Because what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, it's going to say, whoever this is, oops, let me undo the selection here. Whoever this is closest to, that is who I'm going to put this on the grid with. So if it's closer to this grid line instead of this grid line, it's going to get quantized to its right. If it's closer to the left grid line, it's going to get quantized to its left. Which goes to show if you're late enough on a hit or a downbeat or any one of the beats, the sub divisions as you're performing, some of your stuff you may have noticed got quantized in the wrong place. Did anybody have that happen from their initial performance when they quantized it like right?
Oh,
I've had it happen before.
You've had it happen before. And what that really goes to show is you have to be at least relatively close in terms of time. Does that make sense? So there's only a certain degree of error that can happen or take place.
So basically saying is to clean up, not to actually perform for you.
Exactly. Well, and to further what Ken said, sometimes you have to hard edit this before you go to quantization, because if you quantize it right off the bat, if it's too bad, it won't even quantize correctly. So sometimes you have to go, oh, you know what, like, and I'll give you an example. I've seen performances that look like this. Oh, whoops. Oh, I'm sorry, here. I've seen performances that look like this, where this is supposed to be the downbeat, this is supposed to be the downbeat, this is supposed to be the downbeat, right? And essentially what it points to is quantizing this from this particular point may not be the best or safest thing to do if it gets too far off the grid, especially if I go any further to the right. So a lot of times you have to calculate two things. Is the performance close enough to the grid to even be quantized in the first place, or the grid that we want? And two, if it's not, is it relatively like late or early to itself? In this instance, you can see if this is supposed to be the downbeat, along with this, they're pretty much just late all across the board, which is an easy fix, because essentially, well, of course, you saw how I messed it up, so you already know what the fix is. A little bit of nudging the entire grouping to the left. So sometimes what you'll find is you'll have to do a few little edits here and there. Sometimes you'll have to quantize not as a whole, you'll have to quantize section by section. One of the reasons you might have to quantize section by section is specifically if you have a lot of syncopation in one section and in another section it's very straight. In other words, one section is very straight and on the beat, and the other section is very off of the beat, and maybe it's swung a lot more, and it has to have this kind of vibe. Now, let's look at how we would look at certain parameters when we look at these that we are given for the event operations here in quantization. Down below, notice there's this offset grid by. We could actually have it say, and how many ticks did we get in a quarter note? You guys remember?
960.
Yeah, 960, exactly. So we can actually set this grid that we're using to be offset by a certain number of ticks, which will basically allow it to quantize not exactly to the grid. And there's a couple of reasons you might want to do that. One of the reasons you might want to do that is if for some reason everything else in the performance, like everything else that's happening alongside of this is just slightly on the back side of the beat, you might want to take it back a few clicks, because as soon as you quantize and snap it exactly to the grid, then you run into a problem where everything you quantize sounds ahead of everything else. Does that make sense? That may be one other thing that you have to look at, but when you offset the grid, another thing you may want to look at too is if you're working with live devices and you are not making up for any delay coming back from those devices, you might actually want to be offset by a few ticks on this MIDI data. So there's another element that you might have to look for in terms of making sure everything locks in. If we look below, how's it going?
All right, how you doing?
Good, good to see you.
Yeah, happy New Year.
Yeah, happy New Year. How's your break?
Oh, terrible, man, terrible.
Oh, that stinks. Let me get you a DVD
Nah,
sound.
it's great.
I know. For those of you who didn't have class till the end of the week, you almost had. It was almost like a 3-week kind of stretch. Okay, if we look at below, randomize. Randomize this particular feature, and it gives you a percentage. what essentially happens with randomization in terms of quantization is it will take a select number of accuracy to the grid, which will give you a little bit of some beats that get quantized before the grid, and some beats that get quantized on the backside of the grid, and then some beats that will get quantized directly to the grid in order to mimic a live performance. Where in a real life performance, a little ahead, a little behind, a little on the beat, might be a little loose, and that's where the percentage comes in, but it gives it more of a realistic feel. And below there, you see the swing, include within, exclude within. Now, we just talked about what happens if this region is closer to this grid point instead of this grid point where it should be, right? And that's where the swing features kind of come in, where we see down below swing and how much percentage. This will give us a little more randomization in terms of the floating point between how accurate we are. And swing is kind of this jostle between, like, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's kind of got this almost like a live motion feel. It's kind of a little late, a little hung out, but at the same time, sometimes when it goes to the beat, it drives to the 1. It feels like it's got a little bit of motion to it instead of in the subdivisions being so tick, 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 tick. And what you'll find is a lot of times in performance values, the downbeat is the most important element of the performance. So a lot of the downbeats will be very accurate. The subdivisions that happen in between are the things that really are the focus for what gets swung. So that you fall to the 1, but as things are coming in between, it still has a little bit of movement. Below, the include and exclude within. These features give you the ability to say, hey, if you're outside of a certain value towards my grid, I'm not quantizing you. And essentially, when you actually utilize these features, you'll actually set some of these parameters to say, hey, you know, we are going to include a value that is this close. Let me get back to slip. We are going to include a value that is this close to the grid, but we're not going to include a value, and that's where the exclusion comes in, that is past this particular point. 50% being halfway towards the grid. If it falls on that halfway mark, we're not going to include it as part of what's taking place there. And so you kind of see this little bit of movement that takes place in terms of the flexibility for how we get to apply quantization. One other element that we actually have that I did not mention yet is known as the groove clipboard. And one other thing we can do in terms of applying grooves to quantization is there's the groove clipboard, which you can generate your own grooves. You could use any of the groove styles that are built in. And you'll see some of these have very specific values. Logic swing. These are A, B, C, D. These are only specific variations of their groove. Template contains 1 bar of 4/4. You'll see the options for some of these elements here in timing. You can have it show comments. Most of these don't have them, but when you build, if you build your own, when we get into Beat Detective, we'll talk about exporting grooves or groove templates. And essentially what you can do is you can generate a feel by taking a rhythm that's already generated. Create a feel, use it or paste it to the clipboard, or save it to disk essentially, and then when you're ready to use it, when you do something like quantization, you can import that feel to the quantization of a specific element. So in this section, it's this Logic Swing 8. I'm going to do a Command A. And what it's going to do is it's going to fit to the feel of the groove. And I'll tell you, grooves are very specific to, if you're doing, especially if you're doing a lot of collaboration in terms of electronic bass with a lot of other MIDI elements that are doing a lot of the same types of movement, and they're collaborating with each other in terms of where the pocket is, where the beat should fall. If those elements need to all lock in and they're not happening on a performance basis, one element you can use is the quantization to create the groove and actually save the disk and then apply it in this kind of quantized field. This is found in a lot of other DAWs, the only difference being that in Pro Tools, you kind of get this, it's a little more, just to be honest, the grooves are very specific for when you're working in editing, whereas a lot of more consumer-based types of DAW systems, like GarageBand and things like that, they use grooves as a means of helping you generate your performance in the first place. And so we have not yet faced grooves in Pro Tools because this becomes a kind of a post element when we're working with it in quantization. Any questions on this? Now, one of the things that I told you we weren't going to do, but I'm going to go ahead and do it for you so you see it, is I'm going to go ahead and utilize, I'm going to go back to 8th note, and I'm going to go to note on, note off quantization. Do you see what changed?
Yeah. It brought the end of the note to the next grid mark.
Exactly. End of the note to the next grid mark. Now, what this doesn't take into account, and this is really important because I've had people kind of here and there on this and not really understanding the difference. This does not take into account, and especially in class, since we don't have them, we don't use them a lot, sustain pedal work. You will have your sustain pedal work that will quantize with your notes. But just know that if you don't actually set it up to do that, like if you actually have sustaining pedal notes going between note groupings, like if you had built in so the sustains, it'll quantize where the sustain lifts and ons begin and end, but it won't quantize whether or not you decided to hold them through 3 notes instead of just 1. Does that make sense? If you held them through 3 notes, even though you're applying rhythmic values to the grid, it's still going to hold as a sustain underneath. You'll still hear the attack of your new latch, basically your new performance as it triggers, but it'll still sustain underneath. And I've had students have the issue where their sustain went through and they were trying to figure out, why is my note still playing? I did note off, right? I did note off at a certain duration. What's my complication here? Well, usually the mystery thing is there a sustain feature that's being applied that's still holding your note through on for a longer duration than your note off value? Does that make sense? So just keep in mind that that's happening underneath. Now, we don't utilize that a lot in class because of the fact that in a class situation we didn't provide sustain pedals, but if you start opening up the elements down below, you'll start seeing some of the elements that go along with the expression from the keyboard. And those parameters, they're automatable. Some of them were automatable, but some of them were just CC commands that came along with it, like foot control, like mod wheel, things that you don't automate, you don't set up for automation, but if you were to play on the keyboard and move the mod wheel, it actually tracks it in real time. Does that make sense? So you just have to keep in mind what are the other factors that may be going into play with the MIDI as I'm working through quantization. It is an important factor and an important element to making sure that that particular part of the performance is accounted for when you're working on timing, when you're working on those kinds of elements. You might find that you have to go through and do pitch bend changes in a grid form that allow the pitch bend elements to take place at specific times in time with the beat. Does that make sense? So you end up having some of those other features that do need to be manipulated. Now, when we look at this in terms of quantization, this is all post work. If we were to take this quantization and switch over to input quantize, this is the same feature, and it has almost everything identical to what was done, except once you hit enable input quantize, now your performance as it's being captured will be captured in the method of quantization. Does that make sense? Great example of why to use this and how to use this. Let's go to our virtual instrument. Let's switch over to something that can help us generate some rhythms, essentially. So let's go to the mix window. And instead of taking on the mini grand, let's go ahead and generate a, if we go down to instrument, let's go ahead and generate the X-Band 2.
Oh, what? Oh,
Expand.
starting with the X.
Now we're going to use the expand. The boom is also available. The expand, I think, is kind of one of those elements that gets overlooked because at first glance, the expand is the most attractive virtual instrument I've ever seen. The vacuum, if you look at the vacuum next to the expand, looks pretty killer compared to this thing. This thing looks a little dated. What you may not know if you've never really used this is when you actually get into these banks, let's see, let's get into drums, for instance. All right, we'll do kick. All right, this is what I want you to do. If you go into drums, in bank A, go ahead and select kick. In bank B, go down to drums, select snare. The snare selector. You're going to go down to C, go to drums, select the hats, toms, cymbals selector. And in the last bank, you can just go to drums and let's see, you can pick any one extra thing that you want out of here. Claps, something that's not just a kick and snare. Maybe I'm going to do a clap. The clap, cow, tam selector. Each of these have their own level features. Each of these have their own parameters that you can apply panning to, the effects which are down here at the bottom, which you actually have to activate. What you're going to find before we really start tracking with this, and we have to do a few things to set this up, but what you're going to find inside of this is that you're given several different options for kick and snare, and of course your tom selectors. Let me just this thing up. Okay, so if you go octave down, -1, if you octave down -1 and you start on the C all the way to the left of that keyboard, you'll begin to find everything's available in half-step and whole-step increments in terms of different sounds, one from another. What'll happen is you'll begin to hear specific beats or things that you may like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you track these manually using input quantization. All right, does everybody have sound so far? They have their... We record enable? Oh, you don't. Oh, I'm sorry. You don't have a kick at all? Did you go down, Robert? Jason, was yours working out okay? Bobby, you're okay?
Yeah.
Royce? You're okay?
Okay.
All right, you're good. good, right?
Yeah, I'm running that extra credit to you too.
Yeah.
It's on my other hard drive. So the one at the house.
Oh, wait, you don't have it? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I didn't put it on this hard drive. This is my school hard drive. It's on the one at the house.
Okay. No, which one is next one? And actually, if in between, if you happen to come to school, you can load it to the alias under Audio 220. Make it on the top of the audio alias, Vince. You can put it on the top level of Audio 220.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So I can see, just put your name in there and just put extra credit while you're okay. So now that we've done this, let's go ahead and go to our MIDI editor. Open up your MIDI editor. What we're going to do is, some of you may have absolutely no rhythm, and that's perfect for what we're going to do. What we're going to actually do is we're going to do quantizing on the input. And one of the things you'll notice is, I'm going to get rid of this because I don't need it. We're going to need to delete the MIDI information that you've already used so far. Okay, or that you already created. If you want to keep it, you can. All you have to do to keep it is we're just going to use a new take. So if you want to keep the information you've already created, you can just go over to the edit window. You'll just hit the little arrow right here. You'll hit new. So this will provide a new take. It'll leave your old one intact. You'll have to write in. You can write in a new name if you want to. I guess I should have called mine Kit since I changed it. Okay, let's see, where do we leave off? Oh, okay. If your event input quantization window is not open, please go ahead and open it now. Make sure you go to Event, Input Quantize, and make sure you have selected Enable Input Quantize. We're going to have you lay down a beat, and I would prefer that we do, for now, we quantize. Let's do quantization at this point in time with quarter note quantization. Okay, so we'll keep it very simple. And what I'm going to have you do is find your kick, please, and find the snare of your choosing. So find a kick you like, find a snare you like on the keys. These will be the only two things that you'll play on this first pass. Does that make sense? And you'll want to make sure, is that coming through your headphones or is it?
Yeah, these headphones are on.
Oh, they're just loud. Okay. No, that's fine. I just didn't know.
Yeah, these are wild.
All right, everybody ready?
Yep.
Found your kick, found your snare? All you're going to do is with the input quantization on, just start from the beginning of the session, so you can just hit return. You'll hit command spacebar. Away you go with tracking. All you're going to do is try to loop the same overall rhythm. It could be boom, buka, boom, boom, buka. Just keep doing it a couple times. And what you should see is you should see that set up inside of your quarter note resolution. So please go for it, just track kick and snare. And then we're going to go through and track some hats and some other things. Whatever that other element was, clap or cymbal or whatever. Did you not track? Did you record and enable it?
Oh. I thought we were going like one note at a time.
No, that's step input.
Oh, okay.
This one will actually go, this is live, it's just going to quantize it in real time. All right, go ahead and stop. You should have done enough by now. What you'll see in terms of where it lands if you had your enabled input quantization is you should actually see it match up to grid. Now, if you needed to do more refined resolution, you could back it down to 8 if the beats that you're laying down have more subdivided parts. Okay, I wasn't worried about, and you shouldn't typically be worried too much about the duration of the note when you're utilizing this as an element to cue rhythms, because most of the way these are set up, if you're cueing drum rhythms, is they don't actually hold as long as you hold the key, because there's literally samples that only play for the duration of the sample. So because they're so transient, they really don't get cued off to how long you hold them, unless that element that you're holding is usually something elongated, like a cymbal, or maybe it's if the sample is a sample of something that is longer, like a snare roll or something like that, then the duration that you actually play will be specific in time. Now what I want you to do is go ahead and switch to a couple of things. In your transport, activate your transport. You can go to the window and open your transport. Please select MIDI merge. MIDI merge is, again, this thing right here. We've used it before, but it's these little two arrows hanging out together. MIDI merge. Please activate MIDI merge. And then, once you've activated MIDI merge, go to input quantization and change your resolution to 16th note. Once you've done that, please select like a 4-measure phrase of what you had tracked. Don't do like a long duration. Do a simple duration, because essentially you're going to be able to loop this. As long as you get one of these right, you can loop these all day. Now please find a set of either hats, shakers, claps, whatever it takes that you want to use as your more of a cymbal kind of rhythm, which will be faster than the basic kick snare element that you should have done. Once you find that, you can again record enable that particular track and track alongside of the MIDI data that you already have.
So after we grade it out, that's it. You stand and then record and enable.
Yep, and then you can go away. As long as you hit MIDI merge, then it'll go right on top of your MIDI and it won't erase the data that's already there. And I'm going to get mine on the count off here.
You set the loop?
You can set it to loop record. Yes, sir. Ken?
With the kick and snare that I laid down, with the finger,
Oh, it's fine. You can go back if you need to change the
but
grid.
it's still not playing what I put down.
Well, and it'll change based upon your grid resolution, because it's going to snap it to the grid, and if what you're playing is too broken up, if it's too subdivided, you'll probably have to go back and redo it. Here's what I do. Let's save this. Put it on your tape. And let's have you go through to your kick snare and have you do it in 16th note for now. That way, make sure it captures all of what you're doing. Can you try the rhythm again with the kick snare, and then you can go with your original hats? All right, raise your hand if you've completed this so far.
You can't do loop
Well, sorry, but I want to
because
see
it turns off the MIDI merge.
Oh, you know what you could do? Let's see. you'll end up targeting it to here. So
Okay, so hit the MIDI merge now, right?
no, you can leave it deactivated. You won't need it at this point in time. What it'll do is it's gonna just utilize the same,
Instrument,
Right.
same thing.
right, and you can just highlight wherever you're gonna highlight before. It's just unfortunately that you don't get that ability for this particular kind of setup to do both.
So I have to keep it graded, right?
Yeah, you will have to keep it selected.
Okay.
But I would suggest selecting it in grid
Grid
first.
mode.
Yeah, only because you want to make sure you get the right amount of bars, so when it loops, it doesn't kick you off in the regular position.
Alright, so let's go from
You're okay, right? All right. Are all of you guys done for the most part? Okay. I do want to show you something that will give you the little added things that you might want dynamically that get kind of the timing kind of out of the focus. One of the problems that we'll have is by, of course, being so in time that it gets a little redundant. A couple of things will add to the dynamic composition of how this works out. Obviously, equalization, a balance between which parts are being kind of emphasized. Of course, compression will give you a little bit of fluxing in how the overall sound gets applied. But what I want to highlight is in the MIDI editor, if you go down to the bottom and you open up the velocity section that's down here and you grab on the top part of it and stretch it up so you can begin to kind of see the MIDI area. Oh, I get rid of all this. You begin to see the velocity section a little larger. One of the things I want to point out to you is that if you actually stress and unstress in terms of velocity, not timing, but stress and unstress in terms of velocity, a fluctuation in the performance, you will essentially derive some sort of expression from it instead of it just being, like I can hear yours, if yours was quantized and the velocities were the same, which I could tell they weren't because you could hear the fluxing already, most of yours should have a little bit of characteristic like this. But one thing you're trying to avoid is for it to go and for it to sound like essentially a machine gun. And you're trying to get it to sound like there's a flow. One thing you can do with this, if you grab the grabber tool at the top, now that your velocity is open, but inside the MIDI editor, if you grab the grabber and you go through and you pick out the specific notes. Let's pick the thing that you just added. Whatever the thing was you just added, whatever pitch that was put at, if we grab and highlight those instances like this, so we want to highlight all of the instances you just created. All right, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to use this kind of marquee grab it all at one time kind of element. Now all you have to do is if you go to the pencil tool and you go down into velocity, because all these are highlighted, it's only going to apply velocity changes to what you've done. In mine kind of go back and forth, but there's a couple variations you could do, and you can essentially draw these in. If you wanted them to rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall, that's one thing that you could apply. You could essentially go through and manually say, okay, overall, or should they be lighter or softer in comparison to the kick and the snare? And how do they compare to those elements? And for some of this, you might find that, you might actually want that individual in between kind of feel. But essentially, what you're getting out of it is some form of fluctuation instead of it just being so monotonously on the money all the time. I'm going to turn this off real quick. One of the things I did with mine is I did an emphasis on the offbeat that was also not only a velocity change, but it was a different hat. So when you listen to this, and obviously you can see there's a mishit on the snare if you look at the velocity down at the bottom. One of the things that you also will end up having to make changes to is there will need to be a level of consistency when you manually perform kick and snare. Only because of the real main reason being that when you mix down and work with kick and snare in a real life situation, usually the kick and snare have to maintain their consistency throughout the piece, which means you don't really get a lot of, just from measure 1 to measure 2, those snare volumes necessarily, they don't always fluctuate. They essentially should be consistent enough so that you hear the snare in measure 1 and you hear the snare in measure 2 if they're essentially a loop, if they play like a loop, if they feel like a loop. So we're trying to make sure that there's some consistency there. So you could grab all your snares and make velocity changes to those as well in order to make them a little more consistent. And then of course if you had done, and I don't know how many of you did, but if you had done a snare element that was more like a snare roll, you would actually be able to give your snare a specific type of build. So watch what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to copy these and duplicate them. And bring them down into my snare section just to show you.
That's going to change the sound, though. That's going to make it a snare, right?
Yeah. But what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to build the velocity around it so that I want it to build. So I'm going to get rid of the ones below or underneath it. I'm just going to basically do a snare roll. It's already quantized to the grid, and all I'm going to do is make it so it fluctuates, essentially. All right, overall they're a little too loud. All right, and I'm going to get rid of the hats for this particular section because so there is a little bit of variance that takes place. Now, I always suggest one of the things once you do this is if you do apply some compression to the overall track to give it some fluctuation in terms of its attack and release and how the dynamics are controlled so that it still ends up getting some sort of dynamic variance to it just based upon the attack and the release instead of it being so dry. Because one of the downsides to building these kinds of things is that each sample is mastered individually and they sound great individually, but once you combine them, they sound too artificial to go together. Does that make sense? They don't sound like they gel together as well. They sound kind of like Everybody's fighting for dominance in who's the most powerful. And so you kind of want to give them a little more of an expressive, kind of a randomized expression in terms of the dynamic that'll come from utilizing things like compression and just messing with the attack and release times to get them to fluctuate between, you know, when the kick makes its entrance, how it generates expression through the compressor, from when the snare makes its entrance and how it generates expression through the compression. All right, what we're going to do is I would like to I'm going to go ahead and give you, and I'm going to put on the share drive, my performance. No one's on the computer behind you, right?
No.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and give you my MIDI performance when I used it on the piano. And I'm going to manipulate it so that it's not necessarily correct. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a correct version and I'm going to give you an incorrect version. And what I would like for you to do is I would like for you to correct it to match the incorrect version to the correct version. This will only take a second. Let's see. Get this guy. And then we'll go on break. All right, now what I'm going to do with these is the left, I'm sorry, they're not left and right hands. They're literally just two different finger movements. What I'm going to do with them is I'm going to alter them individually. So you may have to go in and utilize quantization to manipulate certain elements individually and not use the command A format, so just be real careful when you do it.